Boris, it's a pleasure to have you on World Sports. The countdown to the Australian Open continues. Would it be fair to say that this is one of the most open major championships that we've seen in recent times on the men's side?
Well, on paper, that's very much true. I mean, you usually would go with the #1 player in the world, which is Roger Federer. But he hasn't won a tournament lately, and I have a good feeling about Nadal, defending champion. He's out there to prove something, that he's injury-free. He's back to his very best. He played pretty good in Doha in the final last week, where he was a couple of match points up against Davydenko, who won the London Masters at the end of last year. So he started with back-to-back tournament victories. We shouldn't forget Del Potro, the last Grand Slam winner, and is playing on his favorite surface, hard court, and Andy Murray, which I believe has a word or two to say something about the tournament victory.
You touched on a lot of subjects that I want to invest in. Let's start with Rafa. I think he's an interesting story because he hasn't won a title since April of last year. Obviously, he had all the physical problems, but when we saw him here in London in the ATP World Tour Finals, he seemed very slow on his game, and then still he didn't win against Davydenko. He was up, he had a chance, but he didn't win. Have players figured out how to beat him, or is it just a matter of him being slower physically?
Well, in general, when you play a couple of years to tour, players do their homework and study your strengths and weaknesses a little bit. So you always have to improve every year with a new weapon, a new stroke, a new strategy. I think Nadal's biggest problem coming back last year was he came back on hard court, and his best surface is clay. So I think you're going to see the very best once he's back on the clay. He played an incredible Davis Cup final against the Czech Republic. But I see signs of improvement. I saw in a couple of good matches in Doha he played. And I think it's a question of confidence now when he's going to get back to his big victory.
When it comes to Roger, you can never rule him out of anything because he's so good, and skillfully he's probably the top player. I'll let you tell me that instead of me saying that. But the fact he also hasn't won consistently must be an issue for him psychologically, perhaps.
Well, I think he's at a stage where he's only going to get really up for the Grand Slams. You know, he rewrote the history books in tennis last year with his 15th Grand Slam victory at Wimbledon. So whenever there is a normal tournament, a regular tournament, he's going to be ready, he's going to be good, but he's not going to be as motivated as he's going to be for a Grand Slam. So I think, once Melbourne starts, we're going to see the very best of Roger Federer.
And you mentioned Andy Murray. There's so much pressure on him every time Wimbledon comes around, but he's the only one in the top 5 in the world that hasn't won a major championship. Is he going to have to deal with this until he gets his first?
Well, that's the monkey is still on his back. He's got to get rid of it. That's true. That's part of being, one of the best players in the world. It's part of being so much in the spotlight because, where he's from. Again, the hard courts in Melbourne suit his game, I think, even better than at the hard courts of the US Open because it's rebound days. It's rubber underneath, so it's a better court for him. By the end of the day, he's got the tools, he has to prove it.
We need to talk about the women as well, and one of the top stories is the return of the Belgian stars, Justine and Kim. Kim came out of nowhere to win the US Open. Has their return added much-needed profile to the tour?
I personally think so. Every era needs a very clear-cut #1 player. And we have a #1 player, Safina, who hasn't won a Grand Slam. So that's not good for her, but it's also not good for the women's tennis. So the fact that Clijsters came back to the US Open, beat Serena and Venus to get that incredible comeback win. And I think that really induced Justine Henin also to come back. And in the first tournament, they played each other in Brisbane last week. And this incredible 3-set match. So I think that's going to be the story for the Australian Open, that, the Belgium, I call them sisters, against the Williams sisters.
They're very different sisters, aren't they? Justine is about this tall.
That's true.
Kim about that tall and a lot stronger.
But same character, though.
Okay. One last question I wanted to throw your way. There was a story reported recently about a possible World Cup of tennis from the ATP. The Player Council is suggesting having a tournament every 2 years with 32 nations, kind of like the Football World Cup. Novak Djokovic talked about it, and he said it would be a great idea. From a outsider perspective, how would you see this competition developing? Do you think it's a good idea? We've got the Davis Cup. We've got a couple of different team competitions. Is there space for a competition like this in tennis, men's tennis?
Well, in general, anything that promotes tennis international, I think, is good. We just got to be careful with the schedule and the amount of tennis the top guys have to play. They obviously have to play their 15, 79 tournaments a year. Then, it includes the Grand Slams and the ATP final. Then you have the Davis Cup, which is the team competition. Everybody's supposed to participate. Not everybody does, but everybody's supposed to. And then you would add another team competition, they say every 2 years. In general, the idea is good. It's just the year has 12 months only for tennis players, so you have to fit it somehow. I think the injury to Nadal and others is first sign that some of these younger players are playing too much every year.
Finally, Boris, I know you have opinions. That's why we like to have you. We want the winners on the men and the women's side, please, from you right now.
I'm going to pick Nadal winning the Australian Open and Serena Williams.
Thank you, Boris. Always a pleasure.
He actually wanted me to go in his footsteps and become an architect as well. My sister, an interior decorator. So becoming a sportsman as a main profession wasn't really the agenda of my family.
Okay, let's ask some viewer questions, shall we? Jeff asks, now that you're retired, what does a typical day look like?
Well, first of all, I don't have a typical day. I mean, my wife is expecting our first child together. Right. So my main job right now is calming her down.
Good point. Ramu says that you will always be top of the list when it comes to tennis greats, and asks if you would consider starting a tennis academy to attract more youngsters to the game.
That's a very good idea, and it's also part of my agenda. I'm trying to develop an academy, maybe even two, but that's still too early to speak about more in detail, but that's very much a plan for me in the future, to give back a little bit and to teach some of the youngsters in the world what I know about tennis.
KFK asks, who would win in a match between you in your prime and Roger Federer now?
Well, I have to say myself, obviously. But on a serious note, I think on hard courts he would have been better, or on clay, but I would have liked my chance at Wimbledon.
Yeah, well, how good do you think he is?
Well, he's obviously the most successful ever. The best ever is very difficult to compare the legends of the 70s and 80s and with himself. I think, you pick the best. The 60s was Laver, and then, Borg was there, then Sampras was there, obviously Federer for the last couple of years. But it's very difficult to pick one another because different rackets, different timing, different balls even. So it's difficult to say who's the very best. The most successful is Roger.
Which era would you have liked to have played in, out of interest? Was the era that you were playing in the best, do you think?
I played Borg when he was just retiring. Impossible to play on clay. I mean, impossible to beat. I played Sampras in a couple of Wimbledon finals. Impossible for me to beat on the grass. I would have liked Sampras against Federer in their prime, because I think that would have been the very best match. But I've had a 17-year career, so I was fortunate to play with almost them all.
Good stuff. Robert asks, which match was your best, and says that his favourite was when you came back by 2 sets to Peter Gassi. I remember that match at Wimbledon in 1995.
Well, that was a sweet one, because he was just killing me on center court, which was supposed to be my living room, not his. But I was able to come back. But usually the ones I remember most are the Grand Slam finals, because then you win up, you end up holding the trophy up, or when you represent your country and you play in a Davis Cup final. Those mean the most to me.
Faisal asks, what you think set you apart from ordinary tennis players?
I think my biggest quality was probably my mentality, my attitude, never to give up. I mean, I had terrible days, I had terrible matches, but I wouldn't give in and throw in the towel. So I think that was my best quality.
Someone who calls themselves a tennis fan asks if they still call you Boom Boom.
Well, some of the older generation that remembered when I played, they still call me occasionally. Obviously, the younger generations don't know what to do with the name. Yeah. But some of the older players still call me that.
And lastly, this isn't that much of a question, but quite a compliment, really. Angelina says that her firstborn son is called Boris, and he is named after you. And she asks, how often does that happen?
Thank you very much. A big compliment. Happens now and then, especially in Germany. Now, we're having a child. I don't want to give away the sex yet, but it's going to be difficult to find.
His name is called Boris, no.
Well, to find the name as well. So, but it's a big compliment.